If there's one experience I wish I could erase from my memory, it would be what I'm about to share with you. This story isn't just a haunting tale of possession, it's a deep dive into fear, heartbreak, and a darkness I never thought I'd encounter. Her name was Priscilla, and what happened to her still chills me to the core. It started about a year ago when I first met Priscilla. She was a vibrant, cheerful person, full of life and curiosity. I met her through a mutual friend while attending a local arts festival. Priscilla had this knack for drawing people in, not with charm or wit, but with an almost magnetic kindness. She was the type of person who made you feel seen, like you truly mattered. At the time, she lived in a small cottage on the edge of town, a quaint little place surrounded by dense woods. Priscilla loved her solitude and often spoke of how peaceful her home was. But even then, there were signs. Strange little things that didn't add up. She once mentioned how the woods would fall eerily silent at night or how she'd sometimes wake up to the faint sound of whispering. She laughed it off as her imagination, but now I wonder if she was already trying to rationalize something she couldn't explain. One evening, she invited a few friends and me over for dinner. It was a lovely evening, warm, with the sound of crickets chirping in the distance. Her cottage was cozy, filled with little knickknacks and artwork she'd created herself. Everything about that night seemed perfectly normal until we decided to sit in her living room after dinner. On her coffee table sat a peculiar antique music box, ornate and intricately detailed. I commented on how beautiful it was, and Priscilla smiled, explaining that she'd found it at a flea market a few months ago. "It's my favorite piece," she said. At some point during the night, the box began playing on its own. A soft, haunting melody filled the room. We all froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Priscilla nervously laughed, brushing it off as a malfunction. "It's old, you know?" she said, but there was a tightness in her voice that didn't match her casual words. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice subtle changes in Priscilla. She became withdrawn, her vibrant personality dimming. She canceled plans at the last minute, claiming she wasn't feeling well. When I did manage to see her, she seemed distracted, her eyes darting nervously to shadows in the room as if she was expecting something, or someone. One day, I visited her unannounced. As I approached her cottage, I felt a strange heaviness in the air. The usual chirping of birds and rustling leaves was replaced by an unnatural silence. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Concerned, I turned the knob. It wasn't locked. Inside, the air was stifling, and the house felt wrong. The once cozy space was now filled with an oppressive energy. The walls seemed darker, the corners shadowed. I found Priscilla sitting on the floor in her living room, staring at the music box. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and her eyes were hollow. "Priscilla," I said softly, kneeling beside her. She didn't respond at first, but after a moment, she turned to me and whispered, "It won't stop." "What won't stop?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The voices," she replied, her voice trembling. "They keep calling my name." From that day on, things escalated quickly. Priscilla confided in me that she was experiencing unexplainable phenomena, objects moving on their own, the sensation of being watched, and, most disturbingly, waking up to find deep scratches on her arms and legs. I urged her to see a doctor, thinking perhaps stress or sleep deprivation was causing her to hallucinate. But deep down, I knew there was something more sinister at play. One night, I stayed over at her cottage to keep her company. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the music box playing. The melody was slower, distorted, and deeply unsettling. I walked into the living room and found Priscilla standing in the dark, her back to me. "Priscilla?" I called out, but she didn't respond. When she finally turned around, her face was different. Her eyes were glassy, and a cruel, unnatural smile stretched across her lips. "It's too late," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. "She's already here." The next morning, Priscilla had no memory of what happened. She was visibly shaken when I told her about the night before. Desperate, we decided to seek help. A local priest agreed to bless the house, but as soon as he stepped inside, he froze. His face turned pale, and he whispered, "There's something here." Something old and angry. The blessing seemed to agitate whatever was in the house. That night, the activity reached a horrifying peak. Doors slammed shut on their own, the temperature dropped drastically, and shadowy figures moved along the walls. Priscilla screamed, clutching her head as if she was in pain. "I can't take it anymore," she cried. "It's inside me." By this point, it was clear that this was more than a simple haunting. Priscilla was showing signs of possession, unexplainable strength, speaking in languages she didn't know, and a violent aversion to anything religious. The music box seemed to be the source, or at least a conduit for whatever was tormenting her. I reached out to an experienced paranormal investigator, hoping he could shed some light on the situation. When he examined the music box, his face grew grim. "This isn't just an antique," he said. "It's a vessel, a trap for something malevolent." If I thought the events leading up to that night were terrifying, what followed completely redefined my understanding of fear. Priscilla's possession was not just a haunting, it was a descent into a darkness so profound, so malevolent, that it threatened to pull everyone around her into its abyss. After the investigator revealed that the music box was a vessel for something evil, he advised us to leave the cottage immediately. "Whatever's attached to this box doesn't want to let go," he warned. But Priscilla refused. "This is my home," she insisted, tears streaming down her face. "I can't just leave." The investigator nodded solemnly. "Then we need to act fast. But understand this, what we're dealing with is ancient and dangerous. It's not just haunting you, it's feeding on you." He proposed a cleansing ritual, a complex process involving prayers, holy water, and protective symbols. But he cautioned us, the entity would resist. That night, we prepared for the ritual. The investigator drew intricate protective symbols around the house and instructed Priscilla to stay in a soft circle he created in the living room. "No matter what happens, stay inside the circle," he told her. As he began reciting the prayers, the atmosphere in the cottage shifted. The air grew icy, and an oppressive energy seemed to press down on us. The lights flickered violently before plunging the room into darkness. Suddenly, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the house. It was a sound that didn't belong to this world, a mix of rage and pain that sent shivers down my spine. The walls began to shake, and objects flew off the shelves, crashing to the floor. "Stay in the circle," the investigator shouted as Priscilla began to sob uncontrollably. Then, she started screaming, a blood-curdling sound that still haunts my dreams. Her body convulsed, and her eyes rolled back in her head. The investigator continued his prayers, but the entity wasn't letting go without a fight. After what felt like hours, the chaos subsided. Priscilla collapsed to the floor, unconscious but breathing. The investigator was drenched in sweat, his face pale. "This isn't over," he said grimly. "The ritual weakened it, but it's still here. And it's angry." We helped Priscilla into bed, and I stayed by her side that night. She woke up several times, screaming and clawing at her arms as if something invisible was attacking her. I held her hand and tried to reassure her, but deep down, I felt helpless. Over the next few days, the activity in the house escalated. Doors would slam shut on their own, disembodied whispers echoed through the halls, and dark, shadowy figures appeared in the corners of our vision. Priscilla grew weaker, her skin pale and her eyes sunken. She barely ate or slept, and she often spoke in riddles, her voice eerily monotone. One night, as I was keeping watch, I heard footsteps upstairs. Thinking it was Priscilla, I rushed to her room, but she was sound asleep. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way upstairs. The sound led me to the attic, a place Priscilla had told me she never went. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, a wave of cold air hit me. Inside, the attic was filled with old furniture and dusty boxes, but what caught my attention was a large mirror propped against the far wall. As I approached the mirror, my flashlight flickered. In the dim light, I saw my reflection, and then something else. Behind me stood a figure, tall and shadowy with glowing red eyes. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. Terrified, I told the investigator what I'd seen. He wasn't surprised. "Mirrors are often used as gateways," he explained. "The entity is growing stronger. We need help." He reached out to a priest who specialized in exorcisms. Father Gabriel was an older man with a calm demeanor and a deep faith. When he arrived at the cottage, he immediately sensed the presence of the entity. "This house is under siege," he said. "But we are not powerless." The exorcism was scheduled for the following night. Father Gabriel prepared us for what was to come. "The entity will fight back," he warned. "It will use fear, deception, and even violence to stop us. But we must stand firm." As the exorcism began, Priscilla sat in a chair in the middle of the living room, her hands bound with rosary beads. Father Gabriel recited prayers in Latin, sprinkling holy water on her. At first, nothing happened. Then, Priscilla began to laugh, a low, sinister sound that didn't belong to her. Her laughter turned into screams as her body convulsed. "You're not welcome here," Father Gabriel shouted, holding up a crucifix. Priscilla's screams grew louder, and her voice changed, becoming deep and guttural. "She belongs to me," the voice snarled. "You cannot save her." The room grew unbearably cold, and a foul smell filled the air. Priscilla's chair began to shake violently, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Father Gabriel continued his prayers, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. At one point, Priscilla broke free from the chair and lunged at Father Gabriel, her movements unnaturally fast. The investigator and I held her back, struggling to keep her restrained. "Keep praying," Father Gabriel shouted. As the exorcism reached its climax, the entity unleashed its full fury. The walls shook, objects flew across the room, and a deafening roar filled the air. But Father Gabriel didn't waver. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this child," he shouted. With a final, ear-piercing scream, Priscilla collapsed to the floor. The room fell silent, and the oppressive energy lifted. Father Gabriel knelt beside her, murmuring a prayer. "It's over," he said softly. "She's free." Priscilla spent the next few weeks recovering. She had no memory of what had happened, but she was grateful for her help. The music box was destroyed, and the cottage was blessed to ensure no lingering energy remained. Though the entity was gone, the experience left its mark on all of us. Priscilla moved out of the cottage and started a new life far away from the woods. As for me, I still have nightmares about that time, about the shadowy figures, the distorted voices, and the feeling of pure evil. When I left off, the exorcism had concluded with a deafening silence, a weight lifted yet lingering unease. Priscilla was free, or so we believed. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that whatever force had gripped her wasn't entirely gone. What we thought was the end turned out to be just the beginning of an even darker chapter. The first signs that the ordeal wasn't over came subtly. Priscilla returned home, pale and withdrawn but otherwise stable. Her memory of the possession was fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror that didn't quite fit together. She spoke of feeling lighter, yet an overwhelming sadness lingered, as if mourning the days she'd lost to the entity that had overtaken her. Then came the whispers. At first, Priscilla thought she was imagining them, soft, indistinct murmurs echoing from the corners of her room. She described them as almost familiar, like voices she had once known but couldn't place. One night, she called me in tears, saying the whispers were louder, more insistent. She swore they were calling her name. When I visited, the atmosphere in her house felt off. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the temperature fluctuated unnaturally. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a lingering paranoia from the events we'd endured. But then I heard it, a faint, disembodied hum, too low to be a draft or an appliance. Priscilla and I decided to spend the night together in the house, hoping that strength in numbers would quell the unease. Around midnight, as we sat in her living room, the lights flickered, and an icy chill swept through. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow shift across the hallway, but when I turned, nothing was there. "Did you see that?" I asked. Priscilla nodded, trembling. "It's been happening since the exorcism." While cleaning her room the next day, Priscilla stumbled upon an old journal tucked away in a drawer she swore she hadn't touched in years. The journal belonged to her grandmother, who had lived in the house before her. Intrigued, we began flipping through its pages. The entries started innocuously, mundane accounts of daily life, but they gradually grew darker. Her grandmother wrote about strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, doors opening and slamming shut, and unsettling dreams of a woman in black standing at the foot of her bed. One entry, dated decades earlier, caught our attention. "The entity thrives on despair. It binds itself to the house, feeding on each generation. I've tried to fight it, but it grows stronger. God forgive me for what I've done." The words chilled us to the bone. Had her grandmother somehow unleashed this darkness? Or had it always been there, waiting for the right moment to strike? Over the following weeks, Priscilla's mental state deteriorated. She became paranoid, convinced she was being watched. She barely ate or slept, and her once vibrant personality dimmed. What terrified me most was the change in her eyes. They seemed darker, emptier, as if the life within her was slowly being siphoned away. One evening, I found her sitting in her room, clutching the journal and muttering under her breath. When I approached, she looked up at me, her expression blank. "It's not gone," she whispered. "It's waiting." I tried to reason with her, to tell her we'd defeated the entity, but deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. The turning point came one stormy night. Thunder roared, and the rain lashed against the windows as I stayed with Priscilla, determined not to leave her alone. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was her, but when I called out, there was no answer. I followed the noise to the basement, where I found Priscilla standing in the darkness, facing the far wall. Her body was rigid, and her breathing was slow and shallow. "Priscilla?" I called, my voice shaking. She turned to me, but it wasn't her anymore. Her eyes were pitch black, and a malevolent grin stretched across her face. "You should have stayed away," she said, her voice a distorted echo. I backed away, my heart pounding as she advanced toward me. The basement seemed to darken with every step she took. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed a crucifix from a nearby shelf, a relic her grandmother had kept, and held it out. "Leave her alone," I shouted. Priscilla, or the thing possessing her, laughed, a guttural sound that made my blood run cold. She invited me back, it hissed. "You can't save her." The crucifix seemed to hold some power, as the entity recoiled slightly. Gathering my courage, I began reciting the Lord's Prayer, my voice trembling but determined. The entity thrashed and screamed, but I didn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, Priscilla collapsed to the floor, unconscious. The air in the room grew still, and the oppressive energy lifted. When she woke, Priscilla was disoriented but alive. We decided to leave the house immediately, vowing never to return. But as we packed her belongings, we found one last chilling note in her grandmother's journal. "The entity is bound to the house, but it seeks those who defy it. Leaving won't save you, it always finds a way back." To this day, I don't know if the entity still lingers in that cursed house or if it's found a new host. Priscilla and I parted ways shortly after, the trauma of the experience too much for either of us to bear. She moved to a new city, changed her name, and started fresh. As for me, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. At night, I sometimes hear faint whispers or see fleeting shadows out of the corner of my eye. Whether it's paranoia or something more sinister, I can't say. All I know is that some doors should never be opened, and some battles leave scars that never heal. The story of Priscilla's possession haunts me to this day. I've shared it not to frighten, but to warn. Evil is real, and it often hides in plain sight. If you ever find yourself in the presence of something you can't explain, trust your instincts and walk away. Because once the darkness finds you, it never truly lets go. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales of the paranormal.